Hello, this is Matthew Bishop with Driving Change, and today we're talking with Mark Campanale, who is an economist who's worked on environmental issues for a good 25 years, advising many leading firms in the financial system, and has founded two companies, that Carbon Tracker and Planet Tracker, which have really changed the way the financial markets think about environmental risk, particularly climate risk, but also some of the broader environmental risks. And he's a much sought after advisor by governments and investors alike. Mark, I wanted to start by asking you, what, as someone who's been at the forefront of the work to tackle climate change and to change how the financial industry thinks about climate change, what has COVID changed for you?
Thank you, Matthew, for asking me onto your program. COVID's changed a lot. What it's done is it's forced a huge contraction in the global economy, and that contraction's worked its way into energy demand. And if we think of climate change as perhaps the big existential problem of our age, and certainly for the coming century, it's really meant that people are looking at where energy is generated and the burning of fossil fuels, which contribute to climate change. People have realized we can switch to clean energy. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's cleaner. And all those fossil fuel companies that used to dominate the S&P 500, like Exxon, their valuation has collapsed. Investors are fleeing the sector. And of course, you've had the darling of the last year, you've had Tesla, the miracle of new technology. And people thinking, well, actually, this changes everything. How we communicate, how we transport, what energy we generate, how offices function. It's brought forward, in my opinion, it's brought forward the peak in demand for fossil fuels. And it's really tipped us over into the end days, I think, of the fossil fuel economy, which allows us the freedom, I hope, to deal with climate change.
That's a big claim. So that you really feel this is an inflection point. You say it's brought forward the peak for energy demand. So you think we'll never get to the levels of energy demand we had this last year?
So the peak for fossil fuel demand, I think energy demand is growing, particularly in the developing world. That's will still remain the case, but in the developed world, I think demand, particularly for fossil fuels, has peaked. And we've seen probably peak internal combustion engine. The sale of the internal combustion engine car has probably almost certainly peaked. It looks like demand for oil has peaked. Demand for coal globally has almost certainly peaked, particularly in the Western economies.
Although we do see all these reports of coal plants being opened and new coal mines launched in some of the developing
I mean, that's
countries.
true. But the thing you need to look at there, Matthew, is efficiency and operation, and how much of the time they've spent operating. So you can build a new plant, but a lot of these new coal-fired power stations are only operating at 30-40% capacity. And that's really, part of the demise story, is they're not achieving the revenues that a lot of the modelers forecast that they would, because people, even in China, you've got dispatchable power from renewables getting onto the grid before fossil fuels. And who gets onto the grid first in many parts of the world is what counts. Renewables is getting on first. I mean, some economists and others ask me, sort of say, well, Mark, we've seen this before. We've seen something similar, 07, 08. The economy contracted after the financial crisis, but then, of course, energy, particularly fossil fuel energy demand, bounced back. So what's different today? It's very simple. What's different is renewables are cheaper. It's cheaper across most parts of the world, if not all of the world, to generate power from wind and solar and battery storage compared to new build coal or new build gas. And almost certainly it's going to be cheaper to build new renewables than to continue to operate old coal plants. That's the major change. It's been that switch, which I think is going to be the death knell for the traditional energy system.
So, Mark, you really see this as an inflection point. You really feel that demand for energy will never be as high as it was last year?
Yeah, so Matthew, I think the clear thing that's happened is that if demand is to grow back for energy, and it will grow back, particularly in the developing economies, that demand is not going to be met from fossil fuels. That demand is going to be met from renewables. We've got far more renewable energy capacity being built today than traditional or old-style fossil fuels. And the very simple reason for that is that the costs of production for renewables has dropped below that of fossil fuels. And it's a technology switch. So what we see at Carbon Tracker across the world is it's cheaper to build wind and solar plus battery storage than it is to build new coal-fired power, and typically often new build gas as well. The other thing we're seeing is partly with policy, that even economies like China, that when it comes to dispatchable power, the renewable energy is getting onto the grid first. So they have first rights to get their power onto the grid ahead of fossil fuels. And what that's doing is it's making the traditional fossil fuels expensive to build, expensive to run. It's just accelerating the demise of the old technologies. And of course,
so you mentioned policy. Yeah, so you mentioned policy making. Are you seeing in some of these stimulus packages, that this time around policymakers are, leaning with the new technologies over the old technologies, or is there still a sort of default mentality of, whatever creates jobs and gets the economy growing?
Yeah, good question, Matthew. Okay, so I'm going to give you an answer that's broken into two halves, the good part and the bad part. The good part is when it comes to the economic recovery and the stimulus package, particularly at the European Union level, and even in the UK economy, which of course is getting ready to Brexit, we're seeing green stimulus packages. The French and the Germans have been driving it. The British are there too. And if you look at the Biden election program, it does include green stimulus and a green recovery. And it's very simple. There's more jobs to be created in retrofits, clean energy, energy conservation than there is from fossil fuels. So that's the good news. The bad news, Matthew. The purchase agreement by central banks to stimulate the economy, they've been buying fossil fuel bonds and high carbon company bonds at the same rate or faster than green energy bonds. And what that's doing is it's throwing a whole lot of cheap capital to fossil fuel incumbents, which were already teetering on the edge. And actually what that's done, and it's happened in the UK, it's happening in the US, is the stimulus is acting as an artificial bailout of an industry that was teetering on the edge. And I must say, I'm disappointed really by central bankers who had a lot of choices. They should have known better, and they hadn't really thought about it. And as a consequence, we've got businesses that really probably are on their last legs being bailed out by the taxpayer. No, thank you.
So as you look forward, firstly, to COP26 next year and beyond, what are you looking for policymakers who care about fighting climate change to do? And what are the implications of that if they do get their act together and do it?
Yeah, everything from certainty around carbon pricing, certainty around green power, power purchase agreements. We want to see that. The bit that I'm thinking about is slightly technical, but I want to talk about it, which is Carbon Tracker. In our analysis, we think there's around $30 trillion of fixed assets in the fossil fuel economy, pipelines, oil rigs, coal-fired power stations, coal mines, that are going to have to be written down, written off, aggressively depreciated over the next 10, 15 years. And these oil wells, which are going to become redundant, or already redundant in the US, companies are not putting aside the capital to clean it up. So what I want to see happen by policymakers is to make sure that the accounting profession actually does the write-downs and does the stress tests. It's a bit like going into the 07-08 crisis with those AAA mortgage-backed securities, insisting that they're still AAA. We've got the same problem with fossil fuel assets. So that's one area of policy that I'd like to see change and happen with regulators and governments. The other is, again, slightly esoteric, which is we have to see the end game with fossil fuels. We've got growing and continued investment into fossil fuels when we should be declining it. The IEA reckons there's around $1 trillion invested in fossil fuels annually. That has to disappear. And what I think we'll have to do is focus not so much on demand reduction, turning off the light, switching to electric car, all good, of course. What we have to look at is constraining the supply of fossil fuels. And that's why I and colleagues and friends have been interested in the development of what we're calling the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, fossilfueltreaty.org, which is essentially governments, policymakers, civil society, companies sitting around saying all those projects that take us above 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to ration them. We're going to have to constrain supply. We're going to have to cancel licenses, cancel production. And some of you will have seen the announcement from British Petroleum, one of the world's biggest fossil fuel companies, announcing that they're going to cut production by 40%. And their chief exec, Bernard Looney, talked about the declining carbon budget, how much fossil fuels we can burn. First time I've heard a CEO talk about that. This, it happened this week, and they wrote off $17 billion of fossil fuel reserves. Instead of just BP doing it, we're going to need everybody doing it. And that's what I want to see policymakers focus on in the next year.
So that is a big, big idea, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And do you feel, as you look at it over the next year, is that something that could be announced and signed up to at COP next year? Is it something that governments get? I mean, and I'd like to follow that by just asking you also, do you feel like the private sector is now leading on this, or is it still going to be down to government to lead?
Yeah, interesting question. In the case of the treaty idea, it's been driven by scientists, academics, and civil society. And you go, well, how good is that? Well, actually, the nuclear treaties of the 1970s were driven by civil society. And it was, in fact, NGOs and civil society that were the first to go off and start counting the Russian missiles and the American missiles, and then sat around the table and had them draw up the agreement to cut the existence of those huge missile reserves, if we can use that word, that the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians had. And we have to do the same with fossil fuels. So I do think it's possible that it can happen. I spoke to somebody in government, UK government, just last week, and they said, well, look, all policy's been focused on emissions reduction, demand side. Nobody's thinking about supply. The politics are really tough. They said, well, actually, that isn't such a bad thing. It allows us for fresh thinking. It allows for governments to find new ideas. And so I'm hopeful that this will get onto the agenda. About the point about can the private sector move? I mean, the astonishing thing over the last 2 years, and the Financial Times had a big spread on this just yesterday, is how individual private investors and investment institutions have mobilized regardless of government. And this coalition called Climate Action 100, a coalition of the world's largest investors taking on the world's top 200 polluters. That's a coalition of $46 trillion. And I didn't replace a B with a T. It's a T. It's a trillion, not a billion. It's the biggest coalition that's ever been created of investors to sit down with management and challenging them. Now, the government didn't tell them to do that. It was driven by the bottom up. It was driven by individual policy holders of a pension scheme. It was driven by trustees. It was driven by fiduciaries, and goes to the heart of this question really about, what's the point of a retirement plan if there's no planet worth retiring into that's mobilized civil society actors?
So there is this $1 trillion question, or many $1 trillion question, which is really, how serious is this shift? Is it largely rhetorical, or is there something fundamental going on here? Because if I think back to the declarations after the Paris Agreement, I mean, there were lots of business leaders and investors saying, yes, we've got to do this. But you sense they also felt that, in fact, they explicitly said, we mustn't scare the fossil fuel industry. We've got to have a just transition where they're compensated for shifting from their polluting fuels to renewable fuels. And so I kind of, in the end, became a bit depressed by the number of people that were talking about by 2050. Which seems like Keynes' definition of the long term by which we'll all be dead.
Sure.
Is there something really different now in what's going on that makes you optimistic in a way that maybe even after COP21 in Paris you weren't?
Yeah, I think the level of ambition and expectation is there. What people have told me about Paris is in previous years of the climate negotiations, you had these power blocks. You had the business power block lobbying government to not do anything. It's damaging for jobs. And then you had the scientists and the NGOs on the side saying, please do something. What changed at Paris was the investors turning up en masse saying to government, look, a strong climate agreement is in the interest of investors. And coming as a counterforce really to the narrative from the business community. And people often make the mistake thinking that finance and business is the same thing. They're often opposing. The interest of the shareholders is not always the same as the interest of the board, and you've got competing interests. And what the investors are able to do is say to government, look, when these people speak using our money as their voice, they haven't got our sanctioning for it. And that's why you've seen so many shareholder resolutions and groups that were previously slow to act, like BlackRock, fundamentally changing, and BlackRock coming out for a progressive climate deal. And that's really the switch that we've seen. Finance saying, no, we're going to stand for our own position and our own status as interlocutors in the climate negotiations by saying this is the kind of climate agreement we want. And it's on the side of the angels. Is it going to be enough, fast enough? Well, one of the things Carbon Tracker we've worked on with PRI and Vivid Economics and the Energy Transition Advisors is something we're calling the inevitable policy response. People think that, okay, governments are slow to act, nothing's going to change. And what we're saying to the investors, and investors are agreeing, is that actually it's a growing evidence of climate chaos. The ice caps increasingly showing signs of melting, forests burning, 100-degree temperatures in the Arctic, London being 100 degrees for 3-4 days in a row, unheard of. And we're saying it's inevitable that actually governments will act. They won't sit aside because the public will call them to act. And we should expect governments to act. And it's that inevitable policy response that companies have to fear and investors have to ask for, is because people are not going to sit around and do nothing. That's for certain.
So the fundamental question to end on is, if policy response is inevitable, and our audience is mainly of policymakers, what's the number one policy that you would advise a policymaker to be putting as their priority right now over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back to this, switch the narrative from trying to constrain demand, which I feel is a bit like boiling the ocean, telling 1 billion people to turn their lights off. Switch to supply. We know where the supply is coming from. Who's producing the fossil fuels? We know who it is. We know which projects are going to take us above 1.5 degrees. We know who's developing and who owns them. Policymakers should be fixed on an agreement that really gets the key people in the room that are pushing fossil fuels and trying to advance the fossil fuel agenda, and actually show them the science and get them to fix a fossil fuel treaty that constrains supply. That's the one that I really should get people thinking about today, Matthew.
Great. Well, Mark Campanale, co-founder and executive chairman of Carbon Tracker, thank you very much for talking today with Driving Change.
Thank you very much, Matthew.